is Helena Jones, reporting from Global News on May 15, 2012. The devastating, gruesome death of Victoria Stafford has many Canadians questioning whether or not they should reinstate the death penalty. On May 11, 2012, Michael Rafferty was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault of 8-year-old Tori Stafford. Tori was kidnapped in April of 2009. Her body was then found under a pile of rocks 3 months later. Rafferty was sentenced to 25 years in prison with no chance of parole. After the trial, many Canadians started petitioning to reinstate the death penalty. Canada abolished the death penalty for murder in 1976. The last execution in Canada was on December 11, 1962. Should we as Canadians reconsider? Should Canada reinstate capital punishment? This leads to the ultimate question: to what extent do emotions and reason influence the morality of capital punishment? Philosopher Dr. Kerry George has some interesting points on the matter. Here's Dr. George explaining how important it is to consider the reinstatement of death penalty from all perspectives. Dr. Kerry George?
Oh, hi Helena. Thank you for having me. Now, I believe that the death penalty is a very sensitive subject for most, and for us Canadians, it's important to analyze the different perspectives of the subject. And looking more in depth into emotion and reason, we can really see how they influence the morality of capital punishment. Well, Helena, when looking at the death penalty, it's a very sensitive subject for most Canadians. They're kind of on the fence, they don't know what to think about it. So going back to our original question, to what extent do emotions and reason influence the morality of the death penalty, we can look at this from 3 angles: from reason, emotion, and ethics. First, we will look at reason. What is reason? Reason is the use of the mind in a logical manner. One of my favorite quotes is, "That can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence," by Christopher Hitchens. This is a very logical way of thinking. There are 3 ways of reasoning, which include inductive, meaning moving from a particular logic to a more general one; deductive, moving from a general logic to a more specific one; and informal, which seems logical but is flawed. Inductive reasoning can be used in relation to the death penalty argument. We could think, people who are sentenced to death are murderers. Murderers are criminals. Therefore, all criminals should be sentenced to death. The logic behind this is the idea of an eye for an eye. But what if the circumstances change? Some issues that stem from this would be, do all criminals warrant the death penalty? What if they are not murderers but committed some other crime such as rape or kidnapping? The logic then must shift to consider the perspective of others. Deductive reasoning could also be used. We could say, criminals are harmful to society. Murderers are harmful to society. Therefore, all criminals are murderers. We know that this is not the case, and we require other information to avoid coming to hasty generalizations, which could result in the mistreatment and ill conviction of criminals. Lastly, informal reasoning could be used. For example, the use of a loaded question. You're against the death penalty, therefore, you must love murderers. This informal reasoning may make sense, but with a lack of emotion, but is flawed. You must consider the perspective of others. They may be against both the death penalty and murderers. Should we overlook generalizations and stick to reason? Is reason always the best solution to justify murdering others? An approach using simply reason would be that of a mathematician. From a financial perspective, sentencing someone to the death penalty would be a lot more cost-effective than to have to take care of them in jail for the rest of their lives. The average cost being $10 billion a year to house prisoners in Canada, while choosing the death penalty would save an average $5 billion over 5 years. This uses the logic that taxpayers' money could be used on innocent people instead of those in jail. This stems the question, should we base the decision on sentencing someone to the death penalty solely on how cost-effective it would be? Another area we could look at would be the natural sciences. The natural science perspective is also an important one to look at. A biologist might conclude that animals in nature kill off those harmful to their kind. They would kill someone of their own species if it meant saving others. For example, chimpanzees trap and kill other monkeys for food, or if they are a threat to their troops. Chimp are our closest relatives, sharing over 98% of our genetic code. Using the eye for an eye logic, they would advocate that it is only natural that we impart the death penalty on those that have wronged society. Are they wrong? Should we go against what is only natural for us to do? In conclusion, we see how using reason as a way of knowing can be a very persuasive, logical way of viewing the death penalty. At the same time, we can see how logic can be flawed through the use of inductive and deductive reasoning, which could lead to false conclusions and hasty generalizations. It is always important to use reason when approaching such sensitive subjects such as the death penalty, where emotions can sometimes overcome reason. But should we only rely on reason? Should we discount the influence of emotion? Should we be allowed to use emotion when dealing with murderers, or is a combination of reason and emotion best? Another way of approaching the issue is looking at emotion. What is emotion? A natural state of mind branched from an individual's circumstances, mood, or relationships with others. When looking at emotion in regards to seeing whether or not the death penalty should be allowed in Canada, we can look at the quote of one of my favorite philosophers, David Hume. "Reason is always and everywhere the slave of passion." In this quote, David Hume emphasizes that emotion always comes before reason because emotion overpowers reason. In other words, emotions have a large impact on our way of reasoning, but to what extent does emotion impact our way of decision-making? We can explore this issue with the following example. Imagine that you are handed a chocolate bar. You are really craving a chocolate bar, but you know it's unhealthy for you. What do? In this situation, logical decision-making would result in not eating the chocolate bar because it's unhealthy. In contrast, emotional decision-making would result in eating the chocolate bar because it tastes so good regardless to its side effects. For the majority of the time, we choose the latter because we are craving the chocolate bar. Since craving is a strong emotion, it overpowers our logical decision-making and causes us to lose reason. This example is essential in understanding that the majority of the time, emotions have a great effect on your decisions. But can we think logically when using emotions? Should emotion take a part in deciding whether or not the death penalty should be allowed? Emotions are often used to create personal biases, especially when it comes to the issue of the death penalty. Picture this: a person, which we'll call person A, has killed person B. When we look at the situation, we often personalize them and relate it to ourselves to make a decision. Many people would say, if person B, the victim, was a close family member or friend, they would want person A to be sentenced to death. In this case, they would most likely favor the death penalty, since they are likely to sympathize with the victim. But is this the best way of making an ultimate decision? If we were to imagine that we were a close family member or friend of person A, the killer, we would most likely be against the death penalty because we would want person A to be given another chance, since we are likely to sympathize with them. This stems an important question. If we were given another chance to person A, would they learn from their mistake? To what extent is imprisonment an effective way of punishment? We can examine these questions through the area of knowledge of human sciences. According to behaviorist B.F. Skinner, prison is a punishment that does not reduce behavior. Punished behavior is likely to reappear after the punitive consequences are withdrawn, Skinner explained in his book about behaviorism. After being sent to jail for a crime, people often continue committing crimes once they are released from prison. Why is it that punishment seems to work in some instances, but not in others? In psychology class, we learned that researchers have found a number of factors that contribute to how effective punishment is in different situations. Punishment is more likely to lead to a reduction in behavior if it immediately follows the behavior. Prison sentences often occur long after the crime has been committed, which may help explain why sending people to jail does not always lead to a reduction in criminal behavior. This leads back to the questions, is it moral punishment to kill a criminal, since the imprisonment does not always result in changing people for the better? Is emotional decision-making the best way of finding a solution? To what extent is emotional decision-making more effective than logical decision-making? And to what extent does religion and cultural traditions affect our ability of making decisions when it comes to capital punishment? Lastly, we can look at ethics. What is ethics? Ethics is moral principles that govern a group or person's behaviors. In order for something to be moral, there needs to be an agent, intention, and outcome that affects others. First, we can look at religion, comparing Christianity and Buddhism. The Bible states, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed." Genesis 9, verse 6. In this quote, we can see that through the Christian perspective, capital punishment is acceptable through the eyes of God. On the other hand, Buddhism has a very different view. "Everyone fears punishment, everyone fears death, just as you do. Therefore, do not kill or cause to kill. Everyone fears punishment, everyone loves life as you do. Therefore, do not kill or cause to kill." This is from chapter 10 of the Dhammapada. Buddhism has a strong opposition to capital punishment, as they do not believe in inflicting harm on others. Next, we can look at the places of origin, comparing Afghanistan with Sweden. In Afghanistan, the death penalty is an acceptable way to deal with criminals of different kinds. This includes those who have committed crimes such as murder, rape, terrorism, homosexuality, adultery, and drug trafficking. Acceptable ways to deliver the death penalty include hanging and firing squad. If we had grown up in Afghanistan, would our views of the death penalty be different? Are these actions moral? Who's to say they're not? Through the country they have grown up, they have a set of ideals on what is morally acceptable. Next, we can look at Sweden. In Sweden, capital punishment is no longer an acceptable form of punishment for criminals as of 1910. According to the Swedish constitution, it is now illegal to perform any kind of capital punishment, corporal punishment, or torture. In light of this information, is Sweden seen as being more ethical? Who's to say what is moral? Canada holds these same ideals. Does this make them right? In growing up in Sweden, a set of ideals has been placed upon its citizens which has completely altered their way of knowing. And these are just some of the aspects that you need to look at when considering the death penalty. Now back to you, Helena.
Well, thank you, Dr. George, for that insightful explanation. These examples just goes to show how our ways of knowing can be drastically altered through the place we grew up, through the religion we choose to follow, our personal bias and emotions, and through the ways that we choose to reason. Is there a real way of knowing what is right when you have so many underlying factors? In looking at our question, to what extent do our emotions and reason influence the morality of the death penalty, can we conclude that our emotions and reason and ethics all contribute to our overall views of the death penalty? In the case of Michael Rafferty, can we ever agree upon a right punishment? Which ways of knowing should factor the decision the most? To what extent are we to authorize the killing of a fellow human being? You be the judge. And on to the weather with Jason Siegel.